I'm going to start this evening with a quote from political philosopher Roger Unger. If I propose something distant, you may say, interesting, but utopian. If I propose something close, you may answer, feasible, but trivial. The idea of reimagining learning asks us to suspend judgment and conceptualize ideal scenarios. Yet at the same time, unless we speak programmatically and bring the conversation down to the individual student, how do we know if we're moving towards this imagined utopia? For the purposes of my short introduction and for the remainder of the evening, I invite us to try and inhabit these two spaces at once, the utopian and the trivial. Let's start with our greatest utopia here at UWCSEA, the UWC mission. In 1962, Kurt Hahn founded the UWC movement with the education to make education a force to unite people, nations, and cultures for peace and a sustainable future. Yet the social, economic, technological, and environmental context look very different then to ours today. Socially and economically, the world was experiencing the Cold War and rebuilding Europe and Asia. Technologically, we had the first trip around Earth by Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin in Vostok 1. And ecologically, we had Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring about the use of pesticides in the United States started the modern ecological movement. So what does this look like today? MIT's Otto Scharmer describes three divides which we currently experience. An ecological divide, which is the overshoot between the Earth's resources and what we use. A social divide characterized by inequity and poverty. And a spiritual cultural divide characterized by the mental health crisis, depression, and anxiety that many young people face today. Let's add to this the backdrop of globalization characterized by a high degree of interconnectedness between places, people, and processes, as we've all experienced firsthand during COVID. Likewise, digital transformation is occurring across this landscape, even leading to the creation of new industries such as machine learning, 3D printing, and AI. So what might the mission, this utopia, look like if enacted in this present reality? And what trivial steps might we take to move there? In its recent publication, Back to the Future of Education, the OECD outlines 4 scenarios for the future of schooling. I'm going to go through them briefly and then make some connections to things that are our preferred reality here at UWCSEA. So in schooling extended, we see the structures and processes of schooling remain, with more international collaboration and technological advances to support individualized learning. Schools still maintain a strong social function. With education outsourced, we see traditional schooling systems break down. Families create diverse, privatized, and flexible arrangements based on students' needs, with digital technology as a key driver. With schools as learning hubs, we see the school as a physical environment remain, yet walls begin to dissolve between the school and the local environment. Diversity, experimentation, civic engagement, and social innovation are promoted. And lastly, in Learn As You Go, the conception of learning that only happens during certain hours of the day is challenged, and this border and boundary between formal learning and informal learning dissolves, aided by digital advances. So how does this connect to some of our own learning from our circuit breaker and our period of remote learning? As a result of our remote learning experience, we recognize the importance of the social function of school. This connects to the scenario schooling extended. We saw this in feedback from our students. Here we can see trends from over 1,600 K-12 students in a survey about student well-being during the time of remote learning. Survey questions were built around our UWC-SEA well-being principles: autonomy, connectedness, and competence. And we drew some key messages from this feedback. Firstly, remote learning supports student autonomy. It also requires social emotional competencies and executive functioning skills such as self-regulation and self-management. For this reason, older learners fared far better than our youngest learners, such as our kindergartners. And I can say that firsthand, being the mother of a K-1 student at the time. For this reason, a transformation of learning needs to go hand in hand with an awareness of different needs within our community. Secondly, schools as physical environments promote identity development and positive social interactions, which students missed during our full remote learning context. The role of the school to support healthy self-concept and the development of friendships and pro-social behaviors is crucial. From our period of remote learning, we also saw how important it is to match tasks and purpose and have a balance of offline and online tasks. Across all three sections of our school, primary, middle, and high, students asked for more offline tasks as eye strain, neck and back pain, and the monotony of tasks were issues that we saw during remote learning. Here we can see one of our teacher-facing infographics that we created from student survey data during our period of remote learning. And we can see here in student wishes, please try, under balance is offline tasks. Yet digital tools also provide us with affordances. There were a number of benefits that technology brought during remote learning that students liked and found helpful for their learning and their well-being. These specific trends on the screen are from our primary school, but they're similar to what we found in our K-12 continuum. From self-paced learning to a high degree of choice to taking breaks when they need to, these trends suggest the possibility for technology to support both student agency and personalized learning. These are two areas we are actively developing as part of our college strategy, for example, through our uncovering of student pathways in high school. We can see student agency as shared in these quotes about remote learning, characterized by choice and autonomy. So one child says, "I got more time to connect with my family and pursue my hobbies because I could have breaks whenever I wanted." While another says, "I like how you can take as much time as you want because the teachers weren't there to tell you to stop." This connects to what the OECD says about agency. It's about acting rather than being acted upon, shaping rather than being shaped, and making responsible decisions and choices rather than accepting those determined by others. In order to nurture students who take action in the world to improve the local and global issues we face, agency is requisite. We will not be able to address climate change or racial inequality with a passive mode of learning. Students must view themselves as able to act. And technology greatly facilitated student self-efficacy during our time of remote learning. We are continuing to consider ways we can create developmentally appropriate opportunities for student agency, enhanced in part by technology. And of course, students will be part of shaping this as we progress. And as I mentioned before, it is not as much the digitization of learning as its personalization. This trend was across all four of the OECD scenarios. Where is the child and how are we bringing the curriculum to them? So it's personalization of our learning program based on our students' identities, whether that's racial, cultural, linguistic, national, based on their passions, interests, and talents, and also on the opportunities, both physically within our context, Singapore, but also virtually for transformative experiences. The school, community, and wider digital environment are resources in this model that act as supports for student self-actualization. This is directly concerned with some of our strategic work, such as our current focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, our development of interdisciplinary learning, which bridges disciplines and our elements, and an enhanced focus on our experiential learning programs, such as through our recent hyper-local campus adventure outdoor education program, where students came to know more about their Singapore context. Some of these aspects directly relate to the OECD schools as learning hubs scenario. These ideas are also represented in our updated guided statements. a prototype for this year where we can see connections to our revised values and description of holistic learning in the outer ring of circle number 4. Likewise, the inclusion of competencies, what the OECD describes as the mobilization of learning to meet complex demands, shows our commitment to active student engagement that allows them to do something with their learning in a complex, unknown future. Digital competence is an essential literacy for our 21st century world. Students require the skills to learn through technology, as well as essential knowledge about how technology functions. This is crucial to creating well-informed citizens. So having spoken trivially about our experiences with remote learning and some of our strategic next steps, I'd like to end by sharing another utopia as reflected in this quote from Mark Weiser, then chief scientist from Xerox PARC and father of so-called ubiquitous computing, what we now call the Internet of Things. He says, the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life. As we move towards our intentional use of digital learning to promote student agency, personalization of our curriculum, and the ability to enact the mission through competencies, I wonder how we can weave technologies into a complex tapestry that puts the student at the center. With that, I will hand it back to our student MCs, Ethan and Daisy. Thank you again for allowing me to speak tonight, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of this conversation this evening.
Wow, massive thanks to Carla. Daisy, wasn't that really interesting on the multiple points on balancing student well-being and technology?
Yes, it was, and I also loved to hear the perspective of the students themselves. That was really insightful. So now I'd like to jump to a different context of higher education and to hear more about Harvard's approach towards online learning. So to explore why and how the mindset of a world-class traditional institution and its key stakeholder groups changed over time to accept both the principles and the critical need for online learning and how this thinking might apply to our kindergarten to grade 12 school context, please welcome Bharat Anand.
Barat is the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning at Harvard University and the Henry R. Byers Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He's an expert in digital strategy and marketing, as well as corporate strategy. He created Harvard Business School's first executive program on digital strategies for media companies. He has written over 50 articles and case studies, and his scholarly work has received awards and been profiled in media outlets. And his work on digital transformation has influenced startups and established companies worldwide. You can read more about these insights in his book, Content Trap, A Strategist's Guide to a Digital Change. In 2014, Barat helped create and launch the digital learning platforms for Harvard Business School Online, formerly known as HBX. The virtual classroom has been described by Fortune as the classroom of the future. In his current role as Vice Provost, Barat has led the university's efforts to formulate, communicate, and implement strategic priorities around online learning and to leverage technology to create more effective teaching tools, strategies, and resources. Since March, Barat has been a part of the central leadership efforts to support and oversee the university's transition to remote teaching. Barat is also UWC alumni from UWC Adriatic and was actually a member of its first graduating class back in 1984. Welcome, Barat.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Daisy. Let me see if I can share my screen. Good evening, everyone. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you. I am really looking forward to this conversation. And let me just maybe outline the agenda that I wanted to talk about. It starts actually with a personal journey, which is my journey from India to UWC and finally to Harvard. This is obviously UWC Adriatic, which was a profoundly different and transformative experience for me in so many ways. And I just wanted to talk about sort of three aspects of that experience that you can probably draw a direct, even if non-linear line between my experience at UWC and what I've been doing at Harvard for the last 20 years. The first is, I think, as Carla and Daisy and Ethan were referring to, sort of the fundamental nature of social relationships, which were really such a part of the UWC experience. The second, just a profound expansion in horizons for me personally. And third, but not the least important, is the nature of the teaching and the pedagogy, which really influenced me, I think, for so many years subsequently. In fact, I think it's not hyperbole to say that if I were to count in my hands the top 10 teachers in my life, a large chunk of them would probably have come from my UWC experience and my teachers there. So what I wanted to do was talk briefly about sort of what we've been doing at Harvard with respect to online learning. And one main message that I just wanted to convey is that trying to change a system in 9 days or 9 months is not going to tell us a lot about the future of online learning. In fact, our journey started almost a decade ago. And it allowed us, I think, to make this transition back in March when, as we like to say, we had about 300 faculty have some experience with online learning, but that took 9 years. And then in 9 days, we had to move to another 3,000, right? So I'll just talk briefly about both these experiences, the experiences over the last decade and what the implications were for the last 9 months. And then perhaps we can try and look to the future and think about what this means for education in general, but UWC in particular. I'm going to start with this quote, which sort of captures, I think, what many of us have been feeling. Will the classroom be abolished in the future and the child of the future be stuffed with facts as he or she sits at home? So this is really something I think we're all thinking about. The quote was from a journalist, Bruce Blyven, a writer for the New Republic, except that quote was 1924. And this is when radio really came along. And if you look back at the debates 100 years ago at the impact potentially of radio in education, you literally replace the word radio with the internet, you can't make the difference. Part of the point here is I think we shouldn't be concerned, which is things will be okay, but there's going to be sort of many ups and downs in the road ahead. And I think we're at a fundamentally different point than what the experience of radio was. I also wanted to just share a very quick story as a preview for what I'll talk about in education, which has to do with the story of newspapers. So this is really the first industry that was hit, if you will, by the impact of the internet. And if you think about the online news product, in many ways, it's simply dominant compared to the traditional analog news product. Why? There's real-time updating of news. It's easier to search. There's greater variety. It's a richer media format. You have video and audio, not just text, anytime, anywhere access, and so on and so forth, right? And this is the reason why we see this massive decline in print circulation. In fact, the declines have been of the order of 75 to 80%. Except when you look at this chart, one of the things you might notice is I actually neglected to include the time axis by mistake. And so, I wanted each of you to think about when this decline actually starts, which year or month does it actually start? So just take a moment and reflect. And while you're doing that, we might think about sort of various reasons why it might have started in particular years. 1994 is the most commonly cited reason, which is the introduction of the internet. Early 2000s with broadband, 2007, 8 with smartphones. So sort of most, I think, of our guesses would fall roughly in that time range, except when you actually put the time axis on, this decline starts in 1945, so 70 years ago. By the way, what's fascinating is the impact of the internet is empirically indistinguishable from 70 years of technology that came before. starting again with radio, then black and white TV, then color TV, then cable TV, cable news, 24/7 cable news, finally the internet. And yet, when we talk about the impact of online on newspapers, the debates we're having today are simply an order of magnitude more provocative, concerned, disturbing than what we might have had 30 years ago. So why is that? I think now with the benefit of hindsight, we know exactly what the problem with newspapers was. It turns out that online news is not what's killing newspapers, right? The reason really has to do with online classifieds. So that's the job listings, when you go and buy a car, the home sales. Those classifieds account for about 50% of the revenues of newspapers and a much larger chunk of the profits. And that's the light blue line in this chart. That's really what's killed newspapers. But it gives rise to a puzzle of sorts, which is if we think about these two components of a newspaper, online news and online classifieds, they essentially have the same attributes, right? Faster, better, cheaper. Yet in one case, the decline is much slower, in the other case, massive. So why is that? And I think this is a digital metaphor that has implications far beyond newspapers, and I think really teaches us a lot about sort of where learning might go. It has to do with the fact that the way we consume news is really different from the way we consume classifieds. Right? The way we consume news is you and I might have preferences over a particular news site based on the design, the type of news we get, the trust in the source, the price, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's quite likely that decisions you make or our friends make or I make are quite different from each other. Someone might look at NewYorkTimes.com, someone Google, someone Yahoo, and so on. When it comes to classifieds, it's a fundamentally different proposition. Literally the only thing that affects which classified site we go to is who's out there, meaning are there sellers, right? If there's no sellers, there's no reason to buy. And if there's no buyers, there's no reason to sell. So more sellers, more buyers, more sellers. This gives rise to a phenomenon called network effects. But really from our purposes, what's fascinating here is that the impact of the internet has sort of this multi-layered aspect to it. The first is much like news, where, if you will, we're creating content in the hub, we're distributing it to consumers in the spokes, and the internet allows us to reach many more consumers, right? That's the first impact of the internet. I would say 90% of organizations are really focused on that. It's all about scale and reach, but that's not really the power of the internet. The second layer is when we think about spoke to hub interactions, meaning we can actually tell companies or entities, or organizations or teachers what we like at scale. We can hear from consumers, we can personalize things, as Carla was saying. So these are the spoke to hub interactions. This is all about data, AI, personalization. But the third layer is probably the most profound, which is not hub to spoke or spoke to hub, but spoke to spoke interactions. This is peer-to-peer. This is about social learning, right? And this is the tension that I talk about, which is the tension between content and connections. And if we don't leverage the power of connectedness through digital technologies, the fact simply is we're not taking advantage of digital technologies. And this has implications for what happened in the last 9 months that I'll talk about. So I just want you to keep this in mind as we go through the conversation. And then sort of really invite you to step into our shoes as we were thinking about the journey at Harvard when we started thinking about online learning roughly 7, 8, 9 years ago. This is our classroom at Harvard Business School. It's a sort of magical experience, much like the UWC experience. It's a very dynamic conversation with 90 students. Everyone's all in, and it's very interactive, right? And the challenge, just as Carla was pointing to, is how do we take this experience online? So that was the question we were asking ourselves several years ago. And in some sense, the tension is the following, is that one way to do this is simply record what's happening in the classroom, put it online, and you can reach thousands and thousands of students. That allows you to get reach. It's not that good for engagement at the individual learner level, right? So when we think about so-called massive open online courses, it's been fabulous for getting high quality education to millions of people around the world. but engagement at the individual level is probably compromised. On the other hand, you might say, what if we simply created platforms where we could have that interactive engagement with small groups of students online, much like Zoom? Well, that's great for engagement, potentially, but not so good for reach, right? Because the moment you get to 50 or 70 or 90 students, it starts getting unwieldy. I just want to put that at the center of the conversation, because I think that's the fundamental trade-off in online education, is scaling in a way that doesn't compromise engagement, right? Because most models optimize on one or the other. And this is the problem we were really trying to confront. The one thing I'll say is simply taking content, and this is a non-controversial statement, I think, simply taking content and putting it online, much like, let's say, this slide might show, or even this slide might indicate, is not going to be the way we engage students, right? This is, if you will, the PDF of the residential model, right? So I just want to sort of put this framework out there to think about the student experience at the center and what are the drivers of that experience. One aspect is obviously content and curriculum, but it also critically matters how we teach, right? And I'll talk about this in a few minutes. The third aspect is this notion of community, social engagement, peer learning, which I think turns out to be profound in many respects. And the last is the personal context of the student, right? What am I experiencing as an individual? The point simply is that effective learning experiences require much more than simply content transfer. And I think this is something that much of the rapid transition during the pandemic sort of was all about. How do we make sure that students learn, focus on that top left box? But we've really got to think holistically about all the aspects of the student experience. So let me go back. So this was a journey that began about 7-8 years ago at Harvard. And when we started thinking about this, we were really thinking about how do we take the magical pedagogy online, those dynamic conversations. And we boiled it down to 3 principles. One is, and these are principles of what we call inductive and active learning, which is, one is we learn from phenomena, right? That's what makes learning really interesting. As opposed to starting with textbook theory and then concluding with the example, what if we flip that process around and start with the example? By the way, I will say, when I learned chemistry in the IB, this was really one of the most profoundly changing experiences for me, because Anne Braley, who was my teacher at UWC, I remember we learned organic chemistry through 16 experiments. That was it, no textbook. But through those experiments, we were inductively deriving the concepts of chemistry, which frankly made it far more interesting, but also one could retain these ideas for much longer than one might if one was simply reading the textbook. So that's part one. The second is active learning, and the third is peer-to-peer learning. Okay, so these are the 3 principles we started with. And the question we asked was, how do we take these principles and reimagine them in the online medium, right? Let's now forget what's happening in the residential classroom, because if we try and mimic what's happening in the classroom and simply take that online, that's the PDF model. We're not going to be successful. There is simply no chance that we can capture all the experiences that occur in the physical classroom between student and teacher or student and student. So as we started doing this, very quickly we realized that there's certain things we can do online, which in fact might be better than the in-person classroom. Just to give you a sense of this, in our classroom, we distribute these so-called HBS case studies to students. These are cases, 9, 15, 19 pages, written about organizations, individuals, decision makers in various contexts. And that's the basis of a conversation. So students read those cases, we come to class, and we actually have a conversation about what would you do in those situations. Well, it turns out it can get a little tiring reading 3 cases a day for 2 years at a stretch. And so video is something that just sort of brings these cases to life. So what we did in the online medium was actually go out and interview these protagonists through video. And here you see just a sampling of these protagonists, ranging from yoga instructors to CEOs of multi-billion-dollar companies. when we see these individuals live, it just brings the story to life in a way that's actually quite different. So that was part one. Part two is thinking about ways you can interact with the concept, right? So this comes back to inductive learning. If, for those of you who are taking economics in the IB, the notion of fixed and variable costs is something obviously central to any economics course. The left-hand side is typically the way we might teach it, which is start with the graphs, talk about the marginal cost curve, the average cost curves, and go from there. Another way to do it is to actually start with stories which might allow us to really appreciate what these ideas are and why they're so important in business. So on the right-hand side, we have a very different way of explaining the same concepts, which is starting with this question about what happened with the introduction of the Kindle? Why were book publishers really threatened by the launch of the Kindle? And as you start thinking about that question, you realize that the implications were not just on the revenue side, but on the cost side. And the real reason publishers were threatened was not because of variable cost, but a fixed cost structure, and you go on from there. The point simply is, you have a lot of leeway in starting to use these stories to explain ideas in ways that take time. And that time is something that asynchronous learning allows you to do in a way that's really hard to capture everything in the classroom quickly. So that was the second part. The third part is sort of thinking about, again, ways you can interact with the material. So this is a simple demand curve. And one of the things we did in the online offering was allow students to basically play with something called a price slider. So I can move that price knob around. And as I move that, the revenues on the demand curve keep changing, right? As I move up or down. What's interesting is if you're trying to experiment with this to figure out what's the revenue maximizing price, you reach that point of $50 in this particular case. And suddenly you see that elasticity somehow seems to be 1 at that revenue maximizing price. So we're not starting with a formula of elasticity. We're actually trying to get you to appreciate why this concept is so interesting and important. So these are things that you can do at your time by yourself to really play and deeply immerse in these ideas and concepts. So these were just some of the ways that we were trying to create these courses. But as we started doing this, there was something quite interesting that happened. So we started building a platform that was really informed and inspired by these pedagogical principles. By the way, it took about 12 months. As we were doing that, we were having conversations with our students. And I remember 3 of my MBA students who were chatting with me. And after 3 months, I noticed that they were saying something that we really hadn't paid attention to. They kept saying, Professor Anand, we don't just learn from faculty in the classroom, we learn from each other in the gym, in the dining halls, in study groups. Much of that learning happens outside the classroom. And what struck me is they were basically talking about social learning or peer-to-peer learning. By the way, the irony of this was I was writing a book called The Content Trap, which really talked about the fact that you can move beyond content, as I said. And here we were falling into the same trap. Right? This is how insidious the problem is, which is when we think about education, we think about the fact that we have to start with content, expertise from the teachers, and we've got to somehow share this with students. But it goes far beyond. I'm writing this book and we're falling into the same trap. Just think about that. So what we did was pivot the whole project to really think about social learning much more deeply. And just to give you a very quick sense of some of the things we did. So this is the first page of the platform. Okay? On the first page, you don't see any content. It's just a global map. There are these pulsating bubbles which tell you who's on where. You can click on those bubbles, see the live pictures of your fellow students all around the globe and start messaging them to actually connect with them. The thing that was interesting was when we opened this platform back in 2014, on the first day, we had about 300 students all around the globe. And at the end of the first day, there were 13,000 profile views. It turns out what students really want to do is learn about each other and check each other out. The content can come later. Let's first connect and get to know each other before we start debating each other. And this plays out in many, many other ways. So We would show short videos, all asynchronously, invite students to answer a poll. And every student had to answer this poll before moving on. By the way, when you answer the poll, you then see the responses of your fellow classmates in this distribution on the right. That itself provokes you to think about, why is my answer different from everyone else's? You can then message your fellow students, engage in conversation about this concept, and it goes on from there. When we have assessments or assignments, one of the things we can do is not just ask students to submit textual responses or multiple choice, but submit a favorite picture that captures your understanding of this concept. And suddenly you have a collage where I can browse this instantaneously and much faster than simply reading textual responses. By the way, this also goes to peer-to-peer learning when it comes to students asking questions and getting them answered. Just to give you a sense of this, so we created something called peer help, but we realized that simply having a discussion board is not going to do the trick, because most online discussion boards have a very small fraction of the students engaged. Most of the students don't go to the discussion boards. And so we were asking, why is that? Well, it turns out it's pretty simple. You've got to make the discussion board local or relevant to that particular concept. So we said, fine, let's just make the discussion board relevant to any particular content page. But the second is students get scared asking questions. If I ask a question, someone might think, that's not a really smart question. So what we allowed students to do is tag their questions. So I can say, I'm asking sort of an esoteric question, or I'm asking a real world question, or I'm asking a really basic question. By the way, the moment I say I'm asking a basic question, it takes away the license of someone else to say, hey, that's a really basic question. So again, just trying to get into the behavioral psychology of students so they feel confidence in engaging on this. And finally, giving them incentives, which is telling them that part of your grade depends not just on your answers on the tests and the exams, but in the extent to which you answer other students' questions. That little tweak really exploded the participation in peer help. It went from about 5% to 75% on that first day. What's more interesting is, it might introduce risk of some kind, right? Because we're looking at this and saying, how do we know the students are answering their peers' questions in the right manner? This was our biggest fear. And so we had content experts on standby, ready to jump in the moment we saw threads going off in the wrong direction. We waited and waited. And as we saw these discussion threads moving along, it wasn't always the case that the first answer from a student to another student would answer the question correctly, but pretty quickly it would self-correct. The number of times we had to jump in over the first 3 weeks was exactly 0. By the way, that's really humbling, right? Once we create this playfield, so to speak, of the content where students can navigate themselves, they don't really need us. This is the power of peer learning. And what I described was what we were doing at Harvard Business School. There's many experiments in different contexts. One of the most famous is the so-called hole in the wall experiment by Shogata Mitra, where they introduced these computers in villages in India and basically had no one there. And these kids walk up to it and just start trying to figure out, what are these systems? What is this machine? And very quickly start playing with the computers in a way that you would think is simply impossible. One of the things we also tried to do was capture sort of some of the energy and the tension in the classroom. So we created something called an online cold call, right? In the classroom, we might cold call the students and say, Ethan, what do you think? Or Daisy, what do you think? Well, we tried to replicate that in the online platform. So as you're going through it, suddenly at random, a pop-up appears. And it says, Daisy, you've been cold called. You have a minute to answer this question. There's a clock ticking in the corner, 30 words or less. And your answer is visible to the entire cohort with your profile picture. You can imagine it just suddenly creates a level of engagement and perhaps intensity and to some extent fear, but that goes away pretty quickly. But actually more fun, which is I'm actually hearing what my fellow classmates are saying in real time. Part of this is, again, getting students to think on their feet and make mistakes. It's okay to do that because the moment I make a mistake, I will never make that mistake again, right? So these were the kinds of things that we introduced in this platform. As I said, it took us about 12 to 15 months to create this. And this is the geography of conversations we're now seeing worldwide. By the way, the other thing that's sobering is when we opened up the platform, the first cohort that we introduced was simply in Massachusetts, because we said if something goes wrong, we can actually physically interact with these students. As you can imagine, there's a lot of fabulous universities in the Northeast. And when we finished that first cohort, we noticed the students had done really well. I remember us talking to ourselves and saying, we're not going to get another cohort like this again. Well, cohort 3, we opened up globally, 900 students, 300 universities, and they did better than that first cohort. It starts shaking your assumptions about the distribution of talent and where it lies. And I think this is now where we can start thinking about the possibilities of online, where we're combining engagement at scale in a way that also provides access to students who don't have. In terms of data, so of course, as you can imagine, we're getting a lot of data on what student behavior is online. Here's a heat map showing when students work online. And just take a moment to think about when you think students are actually spending most of their time. It turns out, again, the most common answers are probably in the evenings or on the weekends. It turns out it's quite different. So the heat map shows greatest intensity Wednesday evening, Thursday morning. This was in our program. And the reason was pretty simple, which is the module deadline was Thursday at noon. So this is a phenomenon called procrastination, except that we can now measure it, right? And what's interesting is you can then correlate degrees of procrastination with how well students do. And what you see is literally a linear mapping, meaning the longer students take to finish something, or more accurately, the more last minute they're doing the work, the more their grades are compromised. So we're now sharing this data with our students to try to change their behaviors in a way that might actually encourage learning in a more continuous way. In terms of learning outcomes, what we found is that students at the end of an 11-week program, we were comparing the performance of students who were 4-year majors in each of these subjects. So you were a 4-year major in economics at university. Compare that performance of that cohort to students who had never seen economics before. And there is a difference, but it's about 3%. So just think about that, right? This is after 11 weeks, what we're getting to in terms of leveling the playing field of the knowledge of our students. We've now introduced synchronous platforms. This is one called HBS Live, where you have 60 or 90 TV screens and we can engage with students anywhere in the world. But most interestingly, coming back to connections, these connections started asynchronously, but then we noticed students were starting to form study groups of their own, on their own, without us intervening, and then taking those connections offline. Someone in Tokyo, someone in Singapore, Mumbai, Melbourne, London, saying, hey, who else is taking this course? Let's just meet up. Those offline connections in some cases gave rise to friendships, also projects that students started doing with each other. And finally, what we realized is the students were connected to each other in a cohort, but really didn't know the other cohorts. So we sent an email inviting students to the Harvard campus for one day. And this was back in 2015, and we had 600 students show up. And they came from every part of the world for one day, just to meet their classmates who they had gotten to know online. So in other words, when we think about connections, the thing I'd love you to think about is the way this can go, not just from offline to online, but also the reverse, which is creating communities through virtual interactions that then over time create meaningful relationships. All right, so that's basically our experience, and that's what we've been trying to scale in the different parts of Harvard over the last 7, 8, 9 years. And then the pandemic hits, right? This is just a light visual of the experience that happens on the Harvard campus, and this could capture almost any university. You have the campus experience, you have the classes taught by your faculty, you have your interest groups, you have some interactions with alumni through events, you have the social interactions with each other, and so on and so March 12th, which is when we moved to lockdown, basically all this disappears. And in some sense, the challenge was, how do we recreate what's happening on the campus virtually? And we had 9 days to do it. As you can imagine, this is an almost impossible task. Going back to what I was describing in terms of the drivers of learning, we have 3,000 courses to move online. We've got to train our faculty in how to teach online because most of them have never experienced this. We've got to try and think about how do we recreate the connections online, but also fundamentally pay attention to the idiosyncratic personal experiences of students through the pandemic, experiencing technology access challenges, personal disruption, and so on, right? There were some things we did pretty quickly, but the thing I just want to note is that spring 2020 was a very particular case of what online learning is. It is, in our language, the PDF version of residential. All the platforms we had created over the last 7 to 9 years were not really available for us in residential teaching because we hadn't integrated them with the residential learning management systems. That beautiful classroom, that live classroom that I showed you, also not available because we had to go to campus to take advantage of that classroom. So effectively, you're stuck with Zoom and Canvas. And the reason I want to say this is the experience that we had in the spring in high schools, in middle schools, in universities around the world was a very particular experience. What I'd submit is that's unlikely to be the longer term experience as we think about really the potential benefits of online. But we had to make this transition and it was hard. Within 36 hours, we created a site called Teach Remotely, simply to try to hold the hands of our faculty. Here's the things you might want to think about and doing when you move online. And that was really predicated or taking advantage of those 7 or 8 or 9 years of experience. The thing we also try to think about was what happens after 1 p.m.? That entire campus experience has disappeared. So we created something called Socialize Remotely, which is a web-based calendaring platform that allows any student on campus to post an event and then have it, and then invite any other person in the Harvard community, right? Whether it's student, staff, or faculty. The first major signature event we had was by one of our colleagues, Michael Sandel, who was talking about ethics during the pandemic. By the way, we had 1,100 people participate. 500 were from campus, 70 faculty tuned in, and we had another 500 alums. And I think you can probably see where I'm going, which is historically, when we think about the residential campus, most of our interactions, which are deep interactions, are with fellow students in our local physical cluster, whether it's a house, a department, or the undergraduate campus or the graduate school that we're talking about, right? We sort of have these residential sort of local tribes, so to speak. And trying to create these social connections across the entire university is really hard. Hopefully, these are just some ways that we might have started to do this, where we might see a silver lining for what might the online experience offer us that might extend back to the community once we go back to in-person. By the way, we've been tracking the experience of our students and faculty. And one of the things, and obviously there were so many things that we missed in the spring, reading the room, the spontaneous adjustments, the sense of community. But the thing that I found really hopeful in many ways was the fact that 70% of our faculty said, wait, there's something that we can do online that we couldn't do quite as seamlessly in person. Whether it's collaborative workspaces through Google Docs, or the convenience, frankly, of not having to commute an hour back and forth, personalized learning, or I'm giving a lecture and the students are asking questions in chat and answering the questions in chat of each other, guest speakers from anywhere in the world, much like we're doing right now. The core economics course had the Secretary of the Treasury, the head of the World Bank, the head of the Central Bank, of the IMF, come in as guest speakers during this moment. We would never have had that possible during a physical classroom experience. So as we started looking ahead, and frankly, this was not just to the fall, but also looking ahead, one of the questions we've been asking is, how can we take advantage of this moment and really these silver linings, so to speak, to try and really rethink the residential model. Because to be clear, the residential model, while so attractive in many respects, has its shortcomings. One is that even though we're learning from amazing teachers, for any given classroom, we're just learning from one faculty expert. Limited global experiences. Everyone's on campus for the entire year. Very infrequent interactions with alumni, right? We usually meet them at these events or recruiting events. Social interactions confined to the school or house. Sometimes more passive experiences in the classroom, more limited field work, and so on and so on. And so we really created this visual just to, I think, force our thinking to ask about what can we do in the virtual world that might be just fundamentally different. You just take that previous slide and you flip things on its head and you start realizing there might be possibilities here. For instance, cross-university courses. We just launched 2 of them, one by Michael Sandel called Justice in the Pandemic Era, the other by Dan Strag on climate change, which are open to any student across the entire university. One click away. Can we take advantage of dispersed geography by our students to basically bring their local experiences into the conversation and the curriculum, regardless of where you are in the world? So rather than think about it remote learning, maybe we might reframe this as global learning. We have more individualized attention because we've now moved to both larger classes as well as much smaller classes. We can have advisory relationships potentially that are spread across the entire campus so that you don't have to trudge 45 minutes to meet your advisor. Again, it's one click away. Field work, an integral part of the curriculum. Those social interactions that really transcend the individual schools, and so on and so forth. By the way, I will be clear, this is in many ways the aspiration. We implemented some of these things in the fall, but really what we're trying to do is now think longer term and really ask ourselves, what might we do longer term on our campus and with our community that really takes advantage of the best of in-person and the best of online. If we don't do that, I think we would have lost this moment, right? Because there are things that we are now seeing. For instance, the Graduate School of Education, Dean Bridget Long introduced a new round of admissions back in June because they realized that they were going to remote for an entire year, but everyone they had admitted thought that they were going to in person the previous year. So they introduced a new round of admissions. And what was fascinating was the number of applications increased threefold. The experience of the applicants was greater in that online application pool. The quality of applications arguably was better. And you simply got a more interesting cohort, right? Those are the kinds of things we would never have done traditionally. We've now accelerated those actions probably by 10 or 15 or even 30 years. How can we think about this in longer term sense? So I'll just close with this one line, which is reimagining learning, I think, is going to require not just borrowing from the residential experience, but in some cases, even forgetting what it brings to the table. And if we can think about multi-platform education in its most expansive sense, I think then we're starting to think about the future of learning in a way that truly might be a way to engage and inspire and attract students, but do so at scale. So thank you. I hope those comments were somewhat useful. And I'll just close with one question, which perhaps we can take in the Q&A, which is, what might this mean for the future of learning at UWC? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bharat. Your presentation was lovely and really insightful. And I'm really excited to now ask you some questions around what you said. But before we do start, I just want to remind the audience that you can submit your questions for Bharat through the chat function if you have any.
So we actually asked some of our fellow UWC students what they think about when pondering about learning and digital learning and what questions they might have for you, Bharat. So we might start by asking you to respond to some of these after we hear from them. Bharat, here's what they had to say. We'll play a video right now.
As students, we've always had social interaction through school, so we're curious to know how, by removing us from that school environment and going online, how it may impact our well-being.
Do you feel there's a point where companies and schools need to reevaluate what they stand for? And how can we ensure that this change is put into action? And how will our model student change too?
A lot of learning takes place outside of the classroom too, such as in the canteens or on public transport to and from school. How can we make virtual learning open and continuous to all different contexts possible?
Our norms regarding education had now been disrupted, and we had to rethink our allocation of resources, how we adapt to changes, and our philosophy on remote learning versus face-to-face learning. Therefore, how have current disruptions on our behavior, the way we operate, and online learning specifically redefined our perception of education and school?
When thinking about educating for the future, how can we better harness technologies to serve us better? Given interactions on social media is becoming crucial in connected communities, how can we tame social media?
We're also curious to know if there are any positive outcomes of transforming into online learning.
Due to our exponential growth in globalization, our international connections have increased immensely. However, has this created a newfound problem and new distance between the ways we are involved with and interact with our immediate local communities?
Given the socioeconomic inequalities around the world and the problems of accessing technologies and lack of infrastructure in many countries, are we acting from the perspective of privilege when we put our fate in technologies in regards to education?
Are the negative health effects brought up by technology being intensified through this online learning period? And what do we know about how we can combat these issues? So I know you answered a few of those questions in your presentation, but was there anything that stood out to you that you'd like to answer first?
First of all, those were amazing questions, right? Unsurprisingly, I think, from UWC students. So just thank you for asking that. What I heard was actually sort of probably a few themes, I think, Daisy, that cut across some of the questions. So let me just, I think as you rightly said, sort of some of these I might have sort of spoken to in the presentation. By the way, I found it interesting that the language you used in your question about learning from each other was almost exactly the same language that that our students had used when they brought this to my attention 9 years ago. So thank you for that. But maybe I can just take that in pairs, so to speak. So I think there were a couple of questions. I just made a note here about learning outside the classroom, in the canteens, to and from school, on the bus. How do you make that virtual and continuous, in particular compared to the residential experience? And, you know, as I described, sort of on the one hand, we were trying to create these connections intentionally for students who had never met each other physically. And as I said, part of this was, first of all, accessing each other's networks, learning from each other, learning to communicate with each other, which is actually an important part of what we try to create online, which spilled over into virtual synchronous and then live and projects and so on. None of that would have occurred if we didn't think about that intentionally. Like literally we spent 3 months just focused on how do we try and create those connections virtually, right? Now that's where you're starting from scratch, when you don't have these interactions to begin with. And you saw sort of some of what we were able to do over time with respect to these interactions. It's very different when you start with a physical in-person setting and you've already formed those friendships and you're trying to move online in 9 days, right? As we discussed, so much harder. And frankly, I would say that's the tension we've experienced in the last 9 months between what I call content and connections. The content has been okay, right? Students are learning, the faculty are engaged in so much effort to share what they're doing in creative ways, even the lab-based courses and so on. The thing I think we're all worried about is what's happening to those connections. And so we try different things like these virtual events, ways for students to connect with each other. But I think frankly, the part of it that is most concerning, and this is something that I think someone else raised, was about the health implications, right? Because that gets to a fraction, not a big fraction, but a fraction of our students. where we don't know what they're experiencing. Now, I will say it's important to distinguish the impact of remote learning from the broader impact of the pandemic, right? Because those health effects, just observationally, are the same, right? They're happening at the same time. And even though they're conflated, they're happening. Like, we've got to think about them. And it's heartbreaking when we have students who are engaged in a course for the first 2 months and then suddenly disappear, and we don't know what's happened to them, right? So those are the things that I think we're probably the most concerned about. But that's in some sense the way we're thinking about this notion of connections. We can probably get to some of the other questions during the conversation, but I just found the questions deeply, deeply thoughtful. So thank you all for that.
Great, thank you so much for your response. We actually have a question now from a UWCSEA alumni as well in Dilijan, Armenia, from Gabriel, who asked, what elements of a UWC model can be done better with technology, and what elements cannot be done via technology?
That's a great question. And really, I think this is the question for all of you to think about. So here's what I'm going to do, okay? I'm going to give you one part of an answer, but Ethan and Daisy, I'm actually going to ask you for your thoughts, okay? So this is in the spirit of active learning. One thought is the following, which is when you go to a UWC, you're going to a UWC, right? You're going to UWC Singapore or Adriatic or New Mexico. And for those 2 years, you don't really have any interactions with your fellow UWCers at the other 17 UWCs. By the way, when the UWC movement started, as you had noted, we were the first cohort in the Adriatic. There were only 6 colleges back then. We now have 17. Can we take advantage of that network of UWCs in some way that also allows us to sort of transcend what is possible within any particular setting? For instance, if I want to take Spanish in one of the UWCs, it's not offered. What do I do? Well, there might be one of the Spanish teachers in another UWC who we can take advantage of through live streaming or engaging with them, having conversations around common issues that are arising, whether it's around sort of social issues, extracurricular issues, community-based issues. There are obviously themes, I think, that are transcending any one UWC. What if, rather than think about community service at a local level, we also couple that with some kind of UWC type movement at a macro level? So those are just, I think, some examples, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So I don't know if you have any ideas around this, Ethan or Daisy.
Daisy, do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, sure, I can. I take to HL Sciences. I think definitely something that I'm grateful to be in person for this year would definitely be the practical side of science. I can't even imagine how science students dealt with that. So I think something that cannot be done via technology, even though there are websites and practicals in which you can do online, that's definitely something that's really valuable, especially when you said that you learned organic chemistry through like purely experiments. So I think that's definitely something that cannot be better. But I think something else we can definitely improve on is, like you said, our connections with other UWC communities, because when I do travel, and I'm lucky enough to travel to a country that has UWC campus, I always try to visit it. But I definitely think that there can be more done to like interconnect the communities for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think on Daisy's point about and your point about the UWC network, I think in order to maximize the potential that we have with it, I think perhaps there does have to be more emphasis on utilizing this network that we have as multiple UWC campuses, but ultimately working towards one goal. And I think the sharing of resources would definitely help us achieve multiple things, whether it's through technology or not. And yeah, I think, but yeah, mainly the emphasis on connectivity between all the UWC campuses is something important that we definitely need to look at.
You know, I just mentioned a couple of things, picking up on some of the things you both are saying. You know, as I said, probably 3 of the best 10 teachers I've had in my life were at the Adriatic. And I look back and I say, why can't we share that experience with more students around the world? right? So in some sense, I think we're all privileged to be a part of this experience at UWC, but part of this is also generosity. And having that experience be experienced by many more students. Again, that's one possibility. The other is, frankly, from a more selfish perspective, interactions with alumni. It's been 35 years since I graduated from the Adriatic, and this is probably the second time I'm speaking to UWC students. There's so many alumni, I think, who would want to engage in different ways, and I think, again, just sort of seeding some thoughts about ways that one might leverage this. Again, not a substitute for what happens in terms of the magic on any campus, but some ways to start thinking about possibilities.
So you raised a point on privilege and generosity. So we have actually a question from Adrian, and they ask, how do these models of personalized learning address and the issues around privilege and equity? They say they can't help but think of how this seems to operate on the assumption that students, whether it's K1 to or grade 12 or higher education, have access to resources, resources being physical space, strong internet, as well as other digital tools. And how do these models account for these realities?
Yeah, again, what I try and do, Ethan, it's a great question. What I try and do is separate out sort of some of the aspects of access to technology, infrastructure, social spaces, frankly, just bandwidth, right? That were difficult for some fraction of our students. And, we tried various things, which is look at the geography of each student, look at bandwidth in their area. I mean, this was like a massive data-driven project to try and think about almost proactively, where can we ward off some of these issues and maybe even get Wi-Fi to these students or get alums to get them to get access to spaces. But that's sort of in our communities, and we're already privileged communities, right? When we step back and think about, what I was describing in terms of the impact of online education for the world writ large, we've now had 70,000 students roughly go through an HBS online course. Okay, that's in the last 7 years. They get a certificate. By the way, the number of alumni, they're not alumni, they just take one course, but they're getting a Harvard Business School quality experience. That number, if you just compare it to the number of alumni in the history of Harvard Business School, which is 90,000, right? This is a number we've reached in 7 years. Many of those learners do not have access to great physical infrastructure or amazing in-person experiences or the best teachers, right? So when we think about access, I think we've also got to think about sort of how it plays the other way. And that's really where the promise, I think, of scalable education is. The challenge is, how do you do that in a way that's not simply just show and tell or lift and shift or a broadcast mode, but trying to make this interesting, engaging, deeply personal for every single learner, right, as I said. But I think those are two different sides of the coin. And it's useful just to separate them out, which is one, how do we think about access during what happened just now? And as I said, again, you've got to make sure we don't conflate that with the pandemic. Because for some students, they also had issues in their families, right? They're having to look after their siblings, parents working 2 jobs or lost their jobs. That also compounds the issue. But how do we think about this in those different contexts so we're not using this experience in the last 7 months necessarily as an indicator of what is possible, I think, going forward.
Great, thank you. Now we have a question from Piers who asks, what feedback have you heard from employers about this form of education?
It's a great question. And I think, Ethan, you might have asked a question in the video, if I recall, similar to this, which is, how do we think about employers and what they're finding? So there's, let me just answer that in a couple of ways. The first is one of the benefits, obviously, of the education possibilities that I was describing is not just the content, but at the end of the day, if you've passed the course, and we're trying to make it not something which is easy where you just sign in and log in and can type in stuff and pass. there's an exam at the end for at least our core credential, which you've got to take in person. If you pass that, you have earned, in many ways, a credential from Harvard Business School, right? And you know, as you can imagine, that signal is meaningful. So we have a whole bunch of students who write to us, and I receive these emails all the time, from students who say, you know, I was a major in philosophy or English. I didn't have the background in the social sciences or business or economics or accounting. More importantly, I didn't have the confidence to be able to go and apply for a job. Taken this 11 or 15 or 18-hour program, I've learned the content, I've gotten the credential, but more importantly, I have the confidence. And oh, by the way, I got an interview and I got a job, right? So that's on the demand side, so to speak. On the other side, when we think about companies, you know, you can start imagining what this does to the future of learning in companies. So there's a whole debate around the future of work, which is often intertwined with the future of learning. The one thing I'll just say is that almost any organization I know is rethinking learning fundamentally, where we're not thinking about training simply in terms of sending our top 30 or 300 or 900 executives for an in-campus executive education program, but how can we complement that with virtual live or virtual asynchronous, so we think about training 3,000 or 30,000 or 300,000 people. I think that's where the power is really going to come into play, and we're in the early days of that journey.
Thank you, bro. We're just having a few more questions come in right now.
Sure.
I just want to ask quickly while we're waiting for questions to come in, do you think that we have to put more focus onto the mental health effects as well? And I know you said not to blend COVID and online learning together because they're obviously very distinct, but do you think that online learning has contributed all to mental health effects negatively, especially how you said face-to-face and social interactions have also decreased during this period?
Yeah, so in some sense, to step back, Daisy, as I said, it's really hard to think about that question in the context of the pandemic and attribute that to remote learning in some sense, right? Like these were both outcomes triggered by COVID. I would actually step back and go back maybe 10 or 15 years. The question of mental health is becoming probably one of the most concerning aspects, at least in higher education. But I think this is applying also to high schools, is when you look at data, when you speak to teachers, school administrators, superintendents of school districts, oftentimes they would say, this is the #1 issue we're confronting. And why is that happening? You know, I think it's a reflection of many things. There's obviously technology that plays a role. It's, you know, I mean, some people might go so far as to say that social media is creating many kinds of challenges at the same time that it creates also many kinds of connections. There's stresses, frankly, that our kids experience in a way that I don't think we did, right? When you think about the stresses of applying to colleges, getting into colleges, oh my gosh, it's just a different level, I think, than we experienced when we were in your shoes. There's many other stresses, I think, happening. So it is one of the most concerning things, you know, unsurprisingly, you know, we're looking at this pretty seriously. I think many universities, many schools are looking at this. It's really hard to, though, decompose it cleanly into sort of what are the triggers and what are the answers. I wish we knew. But I will second that observation. It's one of the most concerning aspects.
All right. So back on one of your previous answers about the model of online teaching, so what specifically did Harvard teachers think of this model? Like, was it too much work, or was it easy enough for them? Like did they have an online pre-programmed guide for all of this to help them through the process?
That's great. Yeah. So as I said, you know, we had to move to to getting 9,000 of our colleagues online, and then another 3,000 in 9 days, another 3,000 for the fall. What happened was almost an army-like response, I would say. So, as I said, in the first 36 hours at the central level, our office created this cell called Teach Remotely, which, it's open to the public. 95% of our traffic is coming from outside Harvard. Just simple guides to focus on the key things to think about when you're teaching online. Harvard comprises 12 schools, the undergraduate college, 11 graduate schools. Every school operates relatively autonomously. So in some sense, all the 12 schools were then moving into action to create training programs, both asynchronous and live during those 9 days for the faculties. In the summer, they were training workshops. This was coupled by live pilots that the faculty could do just to do a test run. We drew in alums as students to be able to experience this. They had to learn the technology, right? It's like, wait, how do breakout rooms work? How does the chat feature work? How do I keep track of this? So as you can imagine, that was not easy. It was a lot of effort. I would say just, I tip my hat to all my colleagues at the university, both faculty and staff and students who've been engaged in this. I think it's paid off in some pretty remarkable ways. I wouldn't say it's been easy across the board. But as I said, during the talk, what's fascinating to me is more than 70% of our colleagues are now really thinking about what parts of this model we can take when we go back to in-person teaching. The one thing I think you alluded to, Ethan, is the effort it takes, right? It takes a lot more effort to do something where you haven't really built those muscles for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And in many cases, faculty are simply trying to make sure they have those connections with their students. They're holding 3 times the number of office hours. They're getting the graduate students to also have additional office hours. That is not sustainable if this went on for 3 years. But in some sense, I think, again, that's just a hat tip to many of the interim efforts that took place during these last few months. A lot of work went into it. And I'm just proud to say that, we moved down the learning curve in some pretty dramatic ways.
Linking to what you said about, just the technical effects of people not knowing how to use a chat function and having to adjust to that, do you think that there are gaps in knowing how to do things online that we, like me and Ethan, as grade 11 students, should consider to support us in our future university lives?
Sorry, I missed that, Daisy. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Talking about the gaps in online learning that you mentioned and the issues that come with transferring to it, do you think that there's anything that me and Ethan can do as grade 11 high school students that we should consider to support our future lives in university?
You're at UWC, you're experiencing probably the best education I can imagine on earth. Just enjoy the experience you have and focus on what you're doing. The one thing I would say is be curious, right? That was one of the things that UWC taught me, is ask questions. Because that's a habit. I think that once you develop that habit, it's not about the next course or the 2 years or the 4 years of university. It's lifelong, right? And once you have that, you can't put that back in the bottle. It's just something that makes you grow and live and learn every day. And, I would say that has, technology can help, but that's almost orthogonal to technology. So just ask questions, and don't be satisfied till you get answers.
Okay, thank you. I also want to ask you, suppose it's December in 2023, what do you think Harvard will look like?
It's a great question. So we're just starting that conversation right now. Frankly, I'll give you a little bit of sense of some of the things that we're talking about. So what does a hybrid classroom look like, or a hybrid learning experience, where perhaps we're not requiring residential degree students to spend 100% of the time on campus, but maybe 10 or 15% of the time could be off campus, taking a course or a semester elsewhere. And it's not that, semesters outside campus are a new phenomenon, but it was always that when students took a semester off, we basically lost connection with them in a meaningful sense, right? How do we take advantage of multi-platform education in a way that we can retain those connections, but allow students to get a more expansive experience? Online degrees, frankly, we're just starting to think about this. Who would have thought this conversation would be happening in 2020? I thought it would take another 15 years. We're starting to pilot in at least one of the graduate schools, something for next year. What are the learnings from that, and how might that influence what else we do? How do we think about sharing all the great content that's been created asynchronously or synchronously over the last 9 months by our faculty with students outside our boundaries, right? Again, what we described was an experience over the last 9 years of something very intentional where we got 300 faculty. Now we have 6,000. A lot of great content has been created. How do we capture it in ways that are easy to access, digestible, engaging for learners elsewhere? How do we think about literally physically hybrid classrooms? So the business school has created a hybrid classroom. What are the learnings we can get from that? And as we try and change the value to cost ratio, perhaps there might be implications for not just Harvard, but other universities. And there, I'll just mention that everyone is now talking about building digital infrastructure capacities, whether it's courseware, platforms, services. What role can we play at Harvard in helping or partnering with other universities and schools in this domain? So I think there's a lot of things that are probably on the horizon. We're just starting to have these conversations as we sort of lift our head from what's happening with the tactical here and now short-term responses with COVID. And I'm really excited to see what this holds for the future.
So you touched on multi-platform learning. So we have a question asking, well, from your personal experience, do you think certain types of learners do better with online learnings? And if there are any takeaways on certain learning styles that you have?
That's a great question. So let me just say that sort of one observation, which is, when I talked about the fact that we had tried to create this awesomely engaging experience, which was entirely asynchronous, the one shortcoming, which was an intentional design principle in our model, was that there would be limited live interaction with the faculty once the course started, right? It's not because we don't want to engage with our online students. It's simply that all the faculty have residential responsibilities. So it's really hard to add on more work for them to do when they move online. The vast fraction of the online learners, I think it's fair to say, enjoyed those learning experiences, but a very small fraction, maybe 1 to 3%, who want that live interaction, right? In the asynchronous world. They were saying, this is not for us. Now, when we think about multi-platform, it allows us to think about learning styles in all its heterogeneity and really cater to them in different ways. So I'll give you a few examples. Some people watch videos at varying speeds. Some people watch it at 2x speed. Some people actually mute the faculty member. I will confess that when my niece took the HBS core program, and I asked her later on, I'd created one of the courses, and I said, how's the experience? And did you like the videos? And she said, well, I muted you and I just read your transcript. It's a pretty humbling experience, by the way. But for her, reading was much easier than like listening, right? So these learning styles, I think, are very different for students. We can adapt the learning styles to students depending on how we create these programs. So in some sense, I think that gives us a lot more flexibility and richness. Again, just separating out what happened in the last few months, as I think, Daisy, you were referring to, for hands-on lab-based courses, you're doing the experiment in the physics or chemistry lab. That's hard, right? And that's hard across the board. It's not for any particular student. And we've tried to compensate for that by sending, kits to students, literally to their physical locations where they can try and mimic or replicate sort of what we're doing. But I'd say those were probably the challenges more than learning styles. The last thing I'll just say, Ethan, is What's fascinating is in some cases, it might overcome some biases that exist in the residential classroom. I'll give you one. Our female students are oftentimes a little more hesitant to raise their hands in the classroom to speak, right? And as you can imagine, male students sort of putting their hands up. And when you go online, and particularly in that live classroom that I showed you, you can raise your hand by just pressing a button and your screen goes red. What we see is that's completely gender neutral, right? It's much easier for, I think, all kinds of students to get in. So those are some of the things we're looking at pretty carefully, just to see how can we take advantage and lean in to those possibilities.
Great, thank you so much. I think that is our last question for the evening. So I just want to thank you so much for exploring these ideas with us and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And the next topic we're going to be exploring will be in February, and will be based around social justice and access to education.
Thank you both. It was such a privilege and frankly an honor for me to speak to the UWC community. As I said, it was transformative for me in so many ways, so many years ago, and I was blessed by the experience. And just thank you for inviting me and sharing this with being a part of this for the last hour.
Thank you so much as well. I think it's great that
We're very lucky to have your insight on all these topics.
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to let the audience know that UWCSEA will follow up with a reminder and formal invite to the event Ethan mentioned in the new year. Just thank you so much to everyone again, and in particular, Carla and Barat, for your time this evening. We hope it sparked some thinking about how education can transform to better serve humanity. Good night, everyone. Thank you.